Canada's Senate is facing increased scrutiny following an independent auditor's report into the living and travel expenses of 4 senators. The RCMP is now examining the issue, and all this on the heels of the allegations of inappropriate behavior and the dismissal of former Senator Patrick Brazeau. Joining us now for the latest on the Senate scandal in Montreal, Quebec, Bruce Hicks. He's a political science professor at Carleton University. Bruce, good to have you back on the program. How are you doing tonight?
Glad to be with you.
Well, let's really start from scratch on this, because I don't want to pretend that everybody's followed every nuance of this story since it started dripping out several months ago. But let's make the list. It's Senator Mike Duffy, Senator Patrick Brazeau, Senator Pamela Wallin, Senator Mac Harb. The first 3 Conservatives, the last one Liberal. What are they alleged to have done wrong?
Right. So the Constitution requires that senators meet 2, well, there's a number of criteria, but 2 that relate to residency. One is that you must own property in the province that you are appointed from, a minimum of $4,000 net worth of property. The second is that you must be resident in that province as well, which is a little more ambiguous than just owning property. Because these are fairly well-known figures, Pamela Wallin, is a well-known anchor, as Mike Duffy was a host on both CTV and was a reporter for CBC for many years. Mac Harb was a member of Parliament for Ottawa. Since these people are fairly well-known, the journalists started asking questions about where they actually are resident, because Mac, as an MP for Ottawa, obviously lived in Ottawa. To get a housing allowance or to get certain expenses, you have to live a minimum of 100 kilometers outside of the city of Ottawa. And what seems to have surfaced is that 3 of these senators have claimed that their residency is more than 100 kilometers away from Ottawa, and so therefore they claim a per diem, an expense, for an additional residence in Ottawa. And in response to media allegations about that, and similar allegations were raised about Pamela Wallin, is whether or not her travel was to Saskatchewan, where she's appointed from, or to Toronto, where most people know that she's been a long-time resident. So that's why questions got raised in the media, and that's why the Senate Board of Internal Economy or Economy and Budgets hired some auditors to go through their accounts and to see whether or not there were discrepancies and whether or not they met the Senate rules.
Now, Bruce, some of the senators are challenging these allegations on the grounds that they say the rules have not been and are not clear. Do you think they have a point?
Well, even, Deloitte is the accounting firm that was hired. It acknowledges in the report that there's a number of references throughout the Senate rules that talk about residency in different ways. They talk about permanent residency, they talk about Ottawa residency, constituents residency, and so on. So there's not a common language. And like I say, it's a bit ambiguous. What does it mean to be resident? You're appointed to the Senate, you're expected to attend Senate meetings and therefore be in Ottawa a lot of the year. Used to be the scandal was that senators weren't in Ottawa enough, but because there's this per diem allowance and you can you can get a subsidy for an additional apartment in Ottawa while you're attending Senate meetings. This has left the door open to abuse. And I don't think these 4 are the only people who probably would be found guilty. If you're appointed to the Senate, you're appointed until age 75. The temptation there is no matter where you came from, if you're from Nova Scotia or Prince Edward Island or British Columbia, over time you're probably going to get tired of traveling back and forth. And I think there's probably a number of senators who have over time slowly made Ottawa their residency. Now, whether or not they cheat and claim that they have 2 residences and claim one as an expense, that is the question. But it's only these 4 that were looked at by the auditor. And the result of this will be tougher rules. And once the rules are clear, I think other senators will be sure to follow the letter of the rules. But as for these 4 in particular, we have the strange situation where, yes, 2 of the senators, Brazeau and Mac Harb, are talking openly about challenging this in court to see whether or not the rules are clear. Now, under parliamentary privilege, the Senate has the right to set any rules and levy any fines. So I don't know, and the courts are not supposed to review that. So I don't know that they've got a basis for a legal challenge, but they do have a point about there's been ambiguity about what residency means.
And we should clarify, Brazeau and Harb have both been kicked out of their respective caucuses as well. I note that the RCMP is now investigating this. Does that mean there is something potentially criminal going on here?
Well, the RCMP became under pressure because this was raised daily in the House of Commons. The New Democrats, who've called for abolition of the Senate for a long time, have found this to be a very topical issue to harp on every day. And so, because of the attention, the RCMP openly acknowledged that they have opened a file, but they won't say any more, and they won't say how that is proceeding unless charges are laid. So all it is an acknowledgement that that allegations have been made, that the members of the House of Commons have raised questions, and the RCMP is responding to those allegations. I'm not sure that the RCMP, what laws the RCMP could prosecute under, because these are internal rules, and under parliamentary privilege, both chambers of the House have complete sanctity, if you will, to set the rules and police them without the courts or external forces looking into it. So I'm not sure the RCMP has jurisdiction any more than the courts do to try this. I think this is really an internal Senate matter, and something that the Senate itself has already made a determination on by saying how much money each of these senators needs to repay.
Okay, let's make a comparison here to the House of Commons. If this were a member of the Prime Minister's cabinet that were in this kind of trouble, somebody in the PMO would have a quiet conversation with said minister saying, now would be a good time to fall on your sword and save our party a lot of grief and embarrassment. Is there a similar set of circumstances when it comes to a senator who, as you pointed out, is appointed to the age of 75 and theoretically can't be fired? How does it work?
Well, the Prime Minister, it's an interesting analogy you raised. The Prime Minister, when it comes to the House of Commons, there's certain key things that are important. For a Prime Minister to be Prime Minister, he must enjoy the confidence of the House of Commons. So he needs tight party discipline in the House of Commons. So he's quick to cut people loose, and he's quick to tell people to toe the line. And of course, he has control over them because he can throw them out of caucus, and he can refuse to sign their nomination papers for them to run in the next election. So he has control over those people, and through the carrot and the stick. The Senate is much harder, right? Is that these people are appointed. Once they're appointed, it's virtually impossible to get rid of them unless they go bankrupt or they're found guilty of a major criminal offense. So the most the Prime Minister can do is throw them out of caucus. Certainly the optics look bad, but in a way, I think up until the more recent developments in this story, I think the Prime Minister's office probably didn't mind that the Senate was looking bad, because this ties into an ongoing First Canadian Alliance and Reform Party, but now Conservative Party pledge, which is to reform the Senate to change it to an elected body.
Okay, don't go there yet, Bruce. Don't go there yet, because we're gonna come back to that later, because there was another new wrinkle on this story over the last couple of days that I want you to comment on first, and that is that Prime Minister Harper's Chief of Staff, Nigel Wright, it has emerged, has apparently paid off the $90,000 that Senator Mike Duffy was supposed to return, which I gather he no longer had. And so Nigel Wright, he says, out of friendship, retired this debt for Senator Duffy. My question is there anything illegal about that?
Well, it certainly, the optics of it are terrible. They seem to have used a lawyer, which is a strange thing for two buddies to do when you're, if you're just, loaning somebody money. There's also some ambiguity about how the thing was structured, on whether or not the money was paid directly to Mike Duffy or if it was given to the lawyer in trust and then used as collateral for Mike Duffy to borrow money from the bank. So there's some sort of strange structuring that took place in order to try and meet the letter of the law. And I think that's probably why there's so much confusion that's emerging yesterday and today about how exactly this was structured and who was in on it. But the optics of it are certainly bad. There was questions raised about Nigel Wright when he took over his chief of staff. This is a very wealthy businessman who, left a corporate job in order to come and work for the Prime Minister, and therefore is bringing his corporate connections and brings corporate Canada to the seat of the Prime Minister. So there's questions about how much influence that appointment took at the face of it, and now you have the same individual who's actually paying a legislator or helping financially a legislator. And whether or not any politician, whether it's a member of House of Commons or the Senate, should be accepting any money, but whether or not they make it public is a question.
Well, just follow up on that. If you hang on before you go on, follow up on that,
okay,
because I appreciate you saying the optics are terrible, but what's the concern here? If one guy wants to help another guy with a $90,000 debt that the second guy says he can't pay back, what's the harm here?
Well, I'm here in Montreal today, where we have a Royal Commission, a commission of inquiry looking into how in this province money has influenced the awarding of contracts to construction companies at the municipal, the provincial, and maybe even the federal level. We're seeing daily testimony where people were giving checks of $100,000 to politicians, and some of it was, seemed to be, it was a violation of the electoral rules, but it wasn't in some cases to pad their pockets. It was to help their re-election or to retire their debt. But it translated pretty quickly into contracts that the city then awarded.
But hang on, but this is different, though. This is different, though, Bruce. Clearly, Nigel Wright doesn't need Mike Duffy for anything. He doesn't need his help in anything financial. There's nothing Mike Duffy can do for Nigel Wright. So again, what's the terrible optics here?
Right. Okay, so the terrible optics of this is less so about the influence. The issue about influence and money, I think, is a generic one. I was talking about it whether or not it should be banned, period, as opposed to whether in this case it might have been acceptable. So I don't know that you're right. The money itself would be influencing Mike Duffy's vote. But what it actually did was it took Mike Duffy out of the four-person inquiry, right? So that Mike Duffy, by cutting a deal very quickly, ceased for a while until the money surfaced to be part of the story. Because what the Senate committee said is Mike Duffy has repaid his money. He's fine. These other two senators have to pay these fines, and we're still looking into Pamela Wallin. So it seemed to be that the money was paid to get this off the front page. Now, of course, it backfired because eventually, once we found out where the money came from, it started a brand new story of its own. But, we shouldn't be quickly paying off to hide expenses. And in Mike Duffy's case, the allegations weren't simply that he was keeping a second residence or keeping claiming his cottage in PEI as his home so he could get expenses. There's also some question about what he charged in terms of expenses, that he was in Florida, but he was billing for that as though he was in Ottawa, a per diem charge. And just yesterday it came out that he was actually, when he was campaigning for the Conservatives during the last election, he claimed expenses against his Senate account. So, to quickly pay money to make the investigation go away, that raises a whole new set of questions.
Okay, Bruce, and we've got a few minutes left here, and this is the overarching issue I guess we've got to tackle here, which is it certainly looks, and we'll let other people judge this, but it certainly looks as if you've got a handful of senators here who have tried to, and I use this term advisedly, they've tried to milk the system for every dime they can using what appear to be, in their view, unclear rules of conduct, and therefore they've done what they've done, or they're alleged to have done what they've done. Question. These aren't the first Senate scandals. They will not be the last Senate scandals, and yet for 150 years almost, we've been unable to dramatically reform or even abolish this House that most Canadians probably think is completely useless. How come?
Well, so to make wholesale reform to the Senate, you actually have to change the Constitution. So to do what the Prime Minister wants to do, and of course that issue is now before the Quebec Court of Appeal. The Quebec government has made a reference to that, and that'll be heard in October or November. The Prime Minister has, in response to that, because he thinks he'll get a negative ruling in Quebec, has quickly moved it before the Supreme Court to see whether or not the Senate can be changed outside of amending the Constitution. My impression is that the court will say, no, it can't. That to make the Senate elected, you actually need to have a constitutional amendment. It's got to be ratified by 7 provinces representing 50% of the population. To abolish the Senate, you need all the provinces to agree. So to do those major changes, you need to get the first ministers together, you need to negotiate, you probably need a referendum that's Canada-wide. And thus the Prime Minister needs to expend personal capital on that. And it may be impossible to do with a separatist government in power in Quebec.
But wouldn't this be an interesting time? Wouldn't this be a time, though, given all of these scandals that are in the headlines on a daily drumbeat of a basis? Maybe this is a time you could get 10 provinces out of 10 to sign on to abolition. What do you think?
Well, I think you could, with the exception of Quebec, right? The PQ government, because it rejects the 82 Constitution, will not agree to any constitutional negotiations. But if you're willing to go without Quebec, you could do the 750 formula and make it elected. Quebec will protest, and it'll alienate a lot of Quebecers because they'll see again that they were left out of the negotiations. But yes, I think the appetite in the rest of Canada may be in favor of Senate reform. But then the Prime Minister himself must be willing to use political capital, and so far he hasn't. Every year he introduces a bill in the House of Commons or the Senate to change the Senate, but he doesn't really push it to second reading. It's more to pay lip service to his campaign platform and to his base. He'd have to expend capital, and I don't think he wants to do that.
Do you think the quality of this Prime Minister's Senate appointments has been any better or worse than of his predecessors?
Well, there's a long history of appointing, party faithful, party hacks to the Senate, as well as some good caliber people. Trudeau started out by appointing great people. He appointed Eugene Forsey, a constitutional expert. He appointed union leaders and so on. But before long, he came under pressure to appoint campaign managers and so on. But other prime ministers, interestingly, have tried to respond to the controversy of appointment. Brian Mulroney, for example, would appoint a liberal or an independent for every couple conservatives that he would appoint, so that he would show a sort of nonpartisan look overall, use it to appoint more women, more Aboriginals, and so on. Chrétien appointed older people because he didn't like the optics of that a person would be in the Senate for the next 40 years. Harper, because he keeps putting bills before Parliament to change the Senate, has sort of used that as cover for him to appoint anybody. And I think some of his appointments, and maybe that's why the media has taken such a good interest in Mike Duffy and Brazeau, is because these are bitterly partisan politicians once they became appointed, and they've become fair game, and so it's coming. The rooster or hens have come back to
chickens coming home to roost.
Exactly, chickens coming home to roost. Thank you. Because the Prime Minister has been rather arrogant with the choices. He hasn't tried to appoint, these great academics or union leaders or people of ethno-racial minorities as symbolic appointments. Rather, he has said, I'm in favor of Senate reform the Senate, and you can elect them. In the meantime, here's the 10 I'm going to appoint this month. I don't think that the caliber has actually been there.
Okay. Bruce Hicks, thanks for this look at what they're now in Ottawa calling anti-Semitism, if I can use that word. That's what they're calling it. Bruce Hicks, political science professor, Carleton University. Thanks for being there on the line from Montreal.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.